In case you missed it, the New York Times recently named this novel as the best book of the 21st century. The New York Times sent out a survey to a list of hundreds of literary luminaries, they called them, and asked these literary luminaries to list their top 10 books published in the 21st century since January 1st, 2000. And they gathered all those top 10 lists, compiled them, and put them in a big long list of 100 top books of the 21st century, and My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante was number one. Do you agree? Tell me in the comments, do you agree? Before I tell you my opinion, I first want to tell you about a different book, a recently published book that could help us figure out if My Brilliant Friend deserves to be at the top. And that very recently published book is called Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan Novels. It's by Gina Frangelo, and it's part of IG Publishing's very cool series called Bookmarked, the Bookmarked series. This book takes a deep dive into the entire Neapolitan Quartet by Elena Ferrante. Here is the entire Neapolitan Quartet. It provides a really compelling analysis of the Neapolitan Quartet's impact on readers and on literature worldwide. So a quick story time of how I came to this book. So I got an email newsletter from my local very favorite bookstore, and of course they list all of their upcoming events. The name Gina Frangelo jumped out at me as I was scanning through the upcoming readings. I knew Gina Frangelo's name from my writing program that I was in. She was a faculty member in the writing program. I didn't have her as an instructor, but she was a writer in the program, so I knew her name, and I also have a bunch of her novels. But then immediately what jumped out after was that the event was about the Neapolitan Quartet and about Elena Ferrante. Indeed, Gina Frangelo had just published this really cool sounding book about the Neapolitan Quartet. So I signed up for the reading, and I ended up going with a bookish coworker of mine. We both are fans of of My Brilliant Friend and the Neapolitan Quartet. So getting ready to go to this event, and the very morning of the reading, that morning, I open up the New York Times, and I had been following along as they were like posting their top 100, because they started at like 100 to 80 and they were going down the list. That morning, I open up the New York Times and I see the top 20 books that they had just posted, I think that day. And of course, right there at the top was number one, My Brilliant Friend. So, of course, I go to this reading that very night, and the first thing they say is like, oh my God, the New York Times listed it as the number one book in the 21st century. And it was just such a weird coincidence and really cool to be in a room with huge Ferrante fans like on that day. That was very cool. So just in case you have made your way here somehow and you are not familiar with the Neapolitan Quartet, these are 4 books that actually can be considered one huge novel. They are written by Elena Ferrante, an Italian writer. That is actually a pseudonym. Elena Ferrante is an anonymous writer, and supposedly nobody knows who Elena Ferrante really is, but we're gonna come back to the question of authorship later on. And the translator is Anne Goldstein, who does an amazingly beautiful job of translating these books into English. These 4 books, this whole one giant novel, follow the friendship of 2 women. It is a friendship that is incredibly complex, incredibly competitive, and very, very enduring. It is an intense friendship between 2 women. They take place in Naples, mostly in Naples, Italy, from about the 1950s up until, I think the last book goes up until the early 2000s, possibly. And the narrative frame is that the narrator is a woman named Lenue, referred to as Lenue, whose actual first name in the novels is Elena. Elena, or Lenue, is writing this. You learn right from the very beginning, she's writing a memoir after the disappearance of her enigmatic, brilliant, beautiful friend, Leela. So Lenu and Leela are in their 60s. Lenu has learned of Leela's disappearance and is writing this memoir of their entire friendship starting in their young childhood after the disappearance of Leela. So the first book starts in their childhood, and then it goes all the way up until like current day when Leela has disappeared. The last book does, all the way up to when Leela has disappeared. So the first book, My Brilliant Friend, the one that won the top spot on this list, it starts with their childhood. I think they're 6-ish in the beginning of the book. It starts with their childhood in a very poor neighborhood of Naples, and then that book ends with Leela's wedding when they're 16 years old. These novels are incredibly notable for their deep and very complex character development, especially of these two characters, Lenu and Leela. It's really just remarkable character work in these books. Frangello's book is a short book. I think it's under 200 pages, and it is a critical analysis of the Neapolitan Quartet. It includes 5 chapters plus a really in-depth introduction. But along with the literary analysis of the books, woven along are glimpses at Frangello's own life and her own personal history with these books. There are memoir-like elements in here. It is not just a literary analysis, it's very much about Gina Frangello's life as well. The Bookmarked series, bookmarked series from Ig Publishing is a very cool series in which contemporary authors take books that meant a lot to them, meant something to their personal lives, and write both a literary analysis but also a personal history of their own experience with the book. And during Gina Frangello's reading, she actually noted that this book is perhaps a bit more of the literary analysis side. There's a lot of research in here than maybe some of the other books in the series, which are maybe more on the personal experience side. So depending on your reading tastes, one or the other might appeal to you. I was very excited when I heard her say that this was more on like the literary analysis side, because that is right up my alley. If you've been here before, you know that I only talk about independent publishers here, which is why I can talk about this subject, because indeed My Brilliant Friend is published by Europa Editions. And let me get my details right here. So Europa was founded in 2005, and it's committed to bringing high quality contemporary European writing to English speakers. Much of the work that they publish is work in translation. And they publish about 35 titles each year, which means they are not a super tiny publisher, but also not anywhere near the size of, like, for example, the big top 5 corporate publishers in the United States. And then Ig Publishing, which published Gina Frangello's book, is a New York-based, award-winning independent press dedicated to publishing original literary fiction and political and cultural nonfiction. So what drew Gina Frangello to write a whole book about the Neapolitan Quartet? Her first encounter with it was actually through a friend who read My Brilliant Friend and said, "You have got to read this book. This sounds exactly like your childhood, Gina. Like, you got to pick this book up. It's like it's you." And she was like, sure, okay, fine. So she picked it up and read the book and was flabbergasted by the number of parallels between her life and the life of Lenu in My Brilliant Friend. Gina grew up in a poor Italian-American neighborhood in Chicago. Her neighborhood was very, very isolated in a lot of the same ways that the neighborhood depicted in the Neapolitan Quartet is isolated from the outside world. There are a lot of issues of poverty and violence and domestic violence and organized crime and misogyny, and a lot of the people in both of these places were born there and stayed their whole lives there. And Gina, just like Lenu, was desperate to get an education so that she could get out of the neighborhood. And in fact, that is what she did, just like Lenu. But then eventually finds that, it's not so easy to escape, the place you come from, just like Lenu. So a lot of parallels there, but then also there were a lot of personal relationship parallels, like a lot of family and friend relationships that are very similar in between Gina Frangello's life and the life of Les Neux in My Brilliant Friend. And that's really why she chose to write about it, because it was so striking to her, and the books were such a powerful reading experience for her because of those similarities. But Frangello is quick to point out that she's not the only one who feels an intense connection to these novels. And in fact, many women in particular who have read the novels feel parallels with their own life and a lot of deep connections with Les Neux and with the characters in the book. And so Frangello writes, "You don't have to be Italian or poor or have a getting out story or to have known anyone in organized crime to feel that Ferrante's novels cut closer to the bone than other works of fiction." And Frangello makes a lot of bold statements about My Brilliant Friend that could really align with My Brilliant Friend winning the top spot for the best book of the 21st century. And a couple of examples that I want to point out, a couple of quotes from Frangello. She writes, "What is clear is that these novels are profoundly ambitious literary feats, unique in tone, style, and scope, when it often seems everything has already been done." So arguing that these novels are doing something very new. And then she also says that these books are arguably the deepest, widest, and richest portrait of a lifelong friendship between two girls/women ever documented in literature. Those are bold statements, I feel like, and I think would help the argument for this being like a great novel of the 21st century, great series of novels. And then Frangello goes on to really deeply engage with several different elements of these four novels. Everything from female friendship to class, violence, gender, daughterhood, motherhood, and finally authorship. And one of the most interesting points and areas that Frangello points out to me was a discussion of hyper-realism. And she actually argues that these are not works of realistic fiction, which they might be perhaps labeled as initially. It's actually, she argues, is hyper-realism because of the intense and obsessive focus by Les Neux on her friend Leela, which no real person would have like that much, unless there's like something very wrong with you, like that much of their thought and life occupied about one person. She's just so intensely focused on Leela that it's not actually realistic at all. So she argues that it's hyper-realism. But Frangello is certainly not without criticism of these novels. And in fact, she points out that to truly love a work of literature, you have to not only praise it, but also interrogate it. And one big area of dissent is how these novels reinforce patriarchal stereotypes of women becoming invisible with age. And there are a bunch of examples throughout these four novels of women becoming invisible with age, and that's not really engaged with in like a critical way within the novels. It's accepted as fact that women, as they age, they become less relevant. Their story is not as worthy of being told. I'm not going to ruin the punchline of my favorite example, which is amazing. It's amazing, because I want you to check it out for yourself, but it's on page 115. So that brings us to the last chapter in this book, which is all about authorship and imaginative appropriation. And I found that to be one of the most fascinating sections, even though not everybody wants to engage with this particular subject regarding these books. Frangello shows how, through a lot of research, how it's basically been proven that Elena Ferrante is a man named Domenico Starnone, an Italian writer. And in Italy, if I understand correctly, it's kind of accepted now as fact that Domenico Starnone is Elena Ferrante, but American readers don't really want to hear it. Like, we don't want to know, we don't want to hear it, we're not interested. The research in here is pretty convincing, so if you have encountered this research in your own world and have any thoughts about it, I would love to hear in the comments like how you feel about this whole subject of authorship. However, Frangello is insistent that general readers should be able to read these books without caring without giving a hoot who the author, who Elena Ferrante really is. The books speak for themselves. The impact is the same. And it would be dismissive of readers' love of these books to say, like, you should care about the fact that Elena Ferrante probably is a man, an old man in Italy. So, and Fringillo refers to Elena Ferrante as she throughout the book because Elena Ferrante presents herself as a woman, as a she. However, for those who do want to think about, like, what does it all mean if Elena Ferrante is a man, there is plenty of interesting material to work with. It is really interesting. I don't know yet if I want to care or not, but it is interesting. Some of, the section about authorship give examples of scenes that hit very differently if you're reading it and thinking Elena Ferrante is a woman, or if you're reading that scene and thinking Elena Ferrante might be a man. But I think the most interesting argument in this whole thing is on a metafictional level, and Fringillo does a really cool job of talking about the entire quartet being an exercise in imaginative appropriation. And that section is really, really cool because, this is Les Nuits, and in many, many ways, Les Nuits is appropriating imaginatively the story of Leela. So the actual book is a story about imaginative appropriation. It is Les Nuits appropriating the story of Leela. So it would be super interesting intellectually if Elena Ferrante, as a man, is writing a story about imaginative appropriation while also exercising imaginative appropriation by pretending to be a woman and writing this novel as a woman. That's just interesting. Read this book if you love the Neapolitan books. This enhanced my understanding of them 100-fold and renewed my love for them and my interest in wanting to reread them and feeling like I need to reread them, even though I have no time to do that. But I also really love the glimpses into Fringillo's life. But back to the original question. Do I believe My Brilliant Friend is the best book to be published in the 21st century? No, I do not. I do not believe that because I don't believe that's a thing. That's not a thing. This is just to sell subscriptions to the New York Times, to get clicks from their subscribers, to create buzz. Everyone loves a listicle. You see, there's videos on YouTube out the wazoo about it. It's just for fun, and it is fun. It is super fun to read through. I loved going through the list, and I love that you could click like what you've read and what you're interested in reading. Very cool. But just look at the list itself to know that this is just a made-up thing. The Friend by Sigrid Nunez is at number 68 and just edged out The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander at number 69. What? What is the measurement there? How can you compare those two books? Those two books are very, very different. There is no way to compare those two books because that's not what this list is doing. It's not comparing these books and ranking them based on their merit. It's taking the top 10 books of a bunch of literary luminaries and comparing which books are mentioned the most, which means it is not just considering books based on their own merit, based on the merit of the books themselves, of the writing, of the theme, of the subject matter. You are also in this list comparing how far that book has gotten out into the world, which is not based on just how groundbreaking and brilliant the book is. How far a book makes it out into the world is impacted by things like who the publisher is, how big of a budget that publisher has, and what kind of influence that publisher has in the publishing world to push that book out into the world. Even what are that author's connections to the literary world? Basically, how much money and influence did some of these books, some of them, have behind them to make it out into the world. And because US publishing is dominated by these top 5 large corporate publishers that is shrinking down in number because they're consolidating and buying each other constantly, because our publishing industry is dominated by these huge corporate publishers, They are going to be publishing and pushing out the books that are gonna have the best bet to sell the most. They don't want to take risks. They're pushing out books that are going to make them money. So it's just important to take that into consideration for a list like this, I think. Not that most of these books, if not all of them, aren't worthy of very, very high praise. They are worthy of very, very high praise and wide readership. This is a list, looking at the list, this is a list of great books. But it's just, I think it's important to keep in mind that it's not just a measurement of brilliance. It's a measurement of popularity, and sometimes a measurement of how many resources did a book and author have behind them to make it out into the world. Which is why it is so cool that my brilliant friend made it to the top spot, because this is a book published by an indie press. This is a work of translated literature, which we know is not represented nearly well enough in the US publishing market. And it's a book about female friendship, which we also know is not a topic that gets a ton of critical literary praise and attention. So it's actually really cool, even though I don't think it's a thing to be the best book in a century. I do think it's cool that this made it to the top of the list. And I think it is a book that is worthy of any reader's time. I think everyone should read this book. I think if you're gonna have a list, it's pretty cool that this made it to the top. But I do want to also point out that these kinds of lists help to sell books that are already selling well. So it's like a cycle that you can't get out of. The books that sell well are going to be the books that continue to sell well and then make it onto lists like this, and then that'll help them sell more. And the same is true for the list that New York Times published a few days later, where they polled their readers for their top 100 books of the 21st century. By definition, that list is going to be books that already sell well, because in order for enough readers to list them, they have to already have sold a large number of copies, right? Again, not that they aren't worthy to be read and not that they aren't great books. These are all great books, and many of them sell well because they are great books. But I went through the literary luminaries version of the list. I don't know what to call it. So not the readers list, but the first list they published. I was aware of 95 out of 100 books on that list. So I had read 33 and I knew 62 of those books well enough to have been able to tell you the premise and probably the author just by the title. At first, when I went through and realized that I was aware of 95, well aware of 95 out of 100 books, I was very proud of myself. I thought, good job, you know a lot about books. And then I was really annoyed. I was really pissed off. I don't want a list like this. I don't want a list like this. I don't need a list like this, because all the other listicles online are already listing these books. Any list you go to, you're gonna have a lot of these books already listed. So this list already lived in my brain. I want a list of books that are worthy of more attention, but aren't yet getting it. That's the list I want. I want a list of books that I don't know about yet. A list of books that are worthy of reaching more readers, but aren't yet reaching those readers. Which is why I think you should check out Gina Frangello's book, if you're interested, of course, about the Neapolitan novels, because it is a way of participating in the totally earned and well-deserved hype of Elena Ferrante's books, but also supporting another author, Gina Frangello, who is awesome and brilliant and deserves your readership too. At least I think. In the meantime, New York Times, if you are listening, ask your literary luminaries for another list of 10 books that they think are worthy of attention, but that they think aren't yet receiving the attention they should be. That is the list I want. So get to work on that. My name is Sarah. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll talk to you later. Bye.